So now that the US has military control over Venezuela with potential access to millions of barrels of oil, question now is, how does America benefit from this massive amount of oil? Can they just take it away? Can they just ship everything back to America? Or should they sell all this oil to the world? In reality, the situation is quite complex and it's not as straightforward as what the media says. So in this video, we'll be taking a look at what options the US has to really get as much economic value as they can out of Venezuelan crude oil, and also the obstacles America would face when trying to do so. Venezuela's oil reserve sits at around 303 billion barrels, and that's mostly the oil that's still underground, not yet extracted. It is the largest in the world by far, but it doesn't mean that the US literally gained hundreds of billions of barrels of oil overnight. It's actually much more complex. The idea that the US has access to all Venezuela's oil is a common misconception. In reality, the Venezuelan oil industry and reserves is a massive problem that will take billions of dollars and years for the US to solve in order to get any sizable gains from capturing Nicolas Maduro. With crude oil, there are different quality levels that are the so-called sweetness. The sweeter and lighter your crude oil is, the easier and less costly it is to convert that crude oil into useful products like gasoline or diesel. The less sweet ones, or what is called sour crude oil, needs more complex infrastructure with higher cost to turn it into gasoline, usually from higher cost of refining and transportations. Most of the crude oil in American territories is light and sweet. What Venezuela has is almost bottom of the barrel gunk that is one of the dirtiest grades even before it leaves the ground. So it's no surprise that it would take billions of dollars of investments to refine these types and ship them out. In order to have any economic gains from these oil, the US could do three things. They could invest in the already outdated and crumbling refinery infrastructure that Venezuela already has, or they could just extract the crude oil and ship it back to the US and refine it themselves. The third option, they could sell the crude oil directly to the international market without any refining. Common denominator for all these options is that it's all very expensive. If American oil giants want to extract more crude oil out of Venezuela's ground, they would need to invest billions for the outdated infrastructure, import thousands of components from overseas, handle logistics and pipelines for transportations before they even see any return on investments. Not only that, remember that Venezuela's leadership has completely changed overnight, and that means the country is still not yet politically and socially stable enough for serious economic investments. Meaning, if you put your money into Venezuela right now, there's a good chance it could go to zero. Arguably, still better than investing when Maduro was in power. But investing at this current time comes with a lot of downsides. We still don't know who will be in charge of the government, how stable the new regime would be. We don't know how laws will be enforced and whether the next government will uphold American laws or become hostile towards American companies. Nobody knows for now, but what we do know is American companies and even international companies are eyeing Venezuelan oil for extraction, investments, or both. It is still unclear as to who would benefit the most from this extraction, how the revenue would be split, and how the US determines who can access this oil. Venezuela's peak oil extraction was at 3.7 million barrels per day in the 1970s, and in 2025, they averaged just 900,000 barrels per day. That's not because Venezuela decided it wanted to cut production, but rather because of years and years of ineffective investments, corruption, mismanagement, outdated infrastructure, bad policy makings, and sanctions from the US all contributed to slowing oil production. With investments opening up, it seems that Venezuela would eventually pump more oil out of the ground, but many factors are still unclear whether this would be a good investment. Chevron, one of the largest oil companies in America that also operates in Venezuela, is more interested in keeping their inventories in Venezuela rather than expanding production. Despite what media headlines are telling us, American multinationals are cautious rather than excited for the opportunities in Venezuela. The oil that many think is a prize is looking more and more like a liability. Without touching any of the oil, the US still have made massive profits, but mostly politically. Even though the US does not have 300 billions of extra barrels of oil, they have control over who and where this oil goes to. Before the capture of Mr. Maduro, Venezuela was shipping most of its oil to its key allies, which are Russia, China, Iran, and India. There are figures floating around that 55 to 80% of Venezuela's crude oil exports goes to China, but it is still very much not verifiable as most of these transactions are shipped through complex intermediaries, transshipping, and processes to mask source of origins. In the oil world, any oil traded must be settled in the US dollars. This agreement is also known as the petrodollar system that was signed in the mid-1970s between the US and Saudi Arabia, saying that any exports of the Saudis' oil must be traded using the US dollars. Of course, not every single country follows this agreement, and that includes Venezuela and China. Nearly all exports of Venezuelan crude oil are settled in the RMB, which is China's currency, which helps China to bypass the petrodollar system and Venezuela to evade sanctions that the US is not too happy about. Now that the US has control over Venezuela, the US would be able to see where the oil goes to and potentially pause future shipments if they wanted to. Any future trades would now follow the petrodollar system, meaning all future exports from Venezuela will be settled in the US dollars and only the US dollars. This would give the US more power internationally as everyone would be forced to use the American currency. China was quite furious about this, and quite understandably so. China already lost a source of cheap oil as they were buying it from Venezuela for a massive discount, and the trades were also settled in the RMB. They also lost most of their investments in Venezuela, and any debt owed to China in the past is likely not recoverable. Not only that, the US now can have influence over regional oil trades, especially with Cuba, who was heavily reliant on Venezuelan oil to fuel their economies, which is already in a disastrous situation where power cuts happen on a daily basis, streets are filled with trash, and citizens don't have enough food to feed themselves. A blow like this potentially could lead to a complete societal collapse for the Cuban people and leaders. It could also pressure Cuba to change regimes or follow the US political orders. But beside political gains, there's also potential immediate economic gains. Ever since the US imposed a blockade against oil tankers going in and out of Venezuela in mid-December 2025, which paused most of its international exports except for those that are going into the US. Because of that, Venezuela has been racking up lots of storage of already packaged and loaded barrels of oils ready for shipment. What the US could do is seize these tankers that are currently on transit to countries that operate under these shadow fleets. On Tuesday, 6th of January 2026, Trump wrote on social media, Venezuela will be turning over between 30 million and 50 million barrels of sanctioned oil to the US, of which will be sold at market price and controlled by Trump. Then, crude oil futures, the Brent and WTI dropped soon after. On the next day, the US did actually seize a Russian-flagged tanker near Iceland and another tanker off of Latin America's waters headed to China, both linked to Venezuela. Both of these seizures are once again a big win for the US, but not so much for countries that buy oil through shadow fleets. The next question is, what would the US do with this oil? They could seize it for themselves or their allies, or sell it at market price, like Trump said. Both would cause political and economic backlash from China, Russia, and its allies. Although doing this is a political win for the US, as these oil shipments are a tool to support Russia for the Ukraine war and stopping China from further economic development. It is now a liability for the US as to what to do do with these tankers because they cannot just simply take it away from themselves. I mean, they physically can. There's nothing stopping them, but there's gonna be consequences. But what kind of consequences? We can only speculate for now. Remember what happened when Trump said he would try to sell Venezuelan oil? Oil futures dropped. This means if the US wants to flood the international markets with cheap Venezuelan oil, supply would increase and prices would drop. Oil prices at the end of 2025 has already dropped more than 20% compared to the beginning of 2025. This is primarily due to oversupply and also a large drop in economic activities around the world. Any further drop in oil prices would hurt oil industries in the US due to job cuts, production cuts, and lost revenues. Politically, it would pressure Russia, who is relying primarily on oil exports, to fund the Ukraine war. But lower oil prices does not mean it won't hurt the US as well. The US would really need to rethink whether touching Venezuelan oil at this time is a good idea. So before you read any more headlines of the US getting 300 billion barrels of extra oil on the news, understand that it's not as simple for the US just to take away these billions of barrels of oil. It comes with risks of both upsides and downsides. Most likely, the reward for capturing Mr. Maduro has to do with political and regional control that the US really wants, rather than just the oil. If you agree or disagree with this, please let me know in the comments what your take is. Also, remember to like and subscribe for future analysis on world events. That's the end of this video. Thanks for watching and I'll see you in the next one.